Over the past month, Night by the Fire has been exploring the debate surrounding constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The first discussion was with panellist Bo. Bogaine Spearim was born in Blacktown, New South Wales, and after spending much of his younger life growing up in Western Sydney, he moved to Brisbane to live with his father, a heavily influential force in his life. Bo's father taught him about identity through dance, song, and connection to Gamilaroi country. Bo has been heavily involved with BASE, Brisbane Aboriginal Sovereign Embassy, since it was established in 2012. His involvement in BASE has ignited a need to speak out about the issues Indigenous Australians are facing and has further developed his understanding of these struggles. After his older brother returned from attending the 40th anniversary of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in Canberra, Bo was invited to the newly established embassy in Musgrave Park. This was a significant moment for Bo. In his recent Night by the Fire conversation, Bo discussed the reasons why he does not support constitutional recognition in favour of focusing solely on sovereignty. His reasoning was drawn from local, national and international community engagement with Indigenous peoples. The second conversation was facilitated by me. My name is Alethea Beetson and I am the Queensland Museum's Indigenous Engagement Coordinator. Myself and the young people that I have worked with shared our opinions on how both constructs can complement one another. Our last discussion 2 weeks ago was with Mark Yettica-Paulson, a campaigner for constitutional recognition movement Recognise. Mark is an Indigenous man from southeast Queensland and northeast New South Wales regions. Mark is the founder and director of the Yettica Group, specialising in facilitating Indigenous leadership and assisting groups to work better as Indigenous and other Australians. Mark has had several years' experience in leadership management, consulting, community education, leadership training, church and community organising and youth work. In 2009, Mark was recognised by The Australian as being one of the top 100 emerging leaders in Australia. In his Night by the Fire conversation, Mark spoke of his support of the Recognise campaign, and along with the reasons why he supports the campaign, the challenges that we face as a nation that has a history of forgetting that has a culture of forgetting its history. So not only do we have to change the founding document, which was written at a time that excluded many, we also face the challenges of having to walk Australia through its own history to do so. Joining us for tonight's discussion is Professor Megan Davis. Megan is a Professor of Law and an Acting Commissioner of the New South Wales Land and Environmental Court. Professor Davis is a UN expert member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples and holds portfolios including Administration of Justice and Gender and Women, and is the focal point of the UN Women and UN AIDS. In 2011, Megan was appointed to the Prime Minister's expert panel on the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution, and continues to be involved in legal discussions on the constitutional issues relating to the referendum model. If you can just take a moment to welcome our panellists. To begin tonight's conversation, I will now hand over to Professor Megan Davis to present her position on constitutional recognition.
That was very sudden.
Sorry.
I didn't actually prepare anything, so it was just ran outside to make a few points about where I think the process is at the moment. As Alethea suggested, I was a member of the expert panel on the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Australian Constitution. My selection to that panel no doubt informed by the fact that I teach in the field and have been publishing in the field for quite some time as a scholar on constitutional arrangements pertaining to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So when I say that, I mean that we are one of the few, at the very least only common law country that has not entered into a treaty with its First Peoples. And as a consequence of that, it has caused all sorts of, very serious problems when it comes to governance as a consequence of that. Now, as I suppose a Western liberal democracy, we're trying to backfill in that we're trying to find ways of better, that's even questionable, but we're trying to find ways of better accommodating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interests, and decision-making into our polity, but we've been really unsuccessful at that. In fact, for a liberal democracy that is so good and certainly so innovative in so many areas of public policy, we've been actually quite appalling when it comes to that issue. So the expert panel obviously handed down its report in 2012, in January 2012, and that's a very long time ago, and a lot has happened since then. So I just wanted to make a few brief comments about where I think it is. One of the main problems, I think, since that time was the fact that, first of all, was the word recognition. I think we were saddled with that word, and I think it has been a straitjacket. I think if you look at all the scholarship of the kind of resistance and contestation in liberal democracies right across the world, you see a politics of recognition. Most First Peoples want to be recognised in some ways within the kind of settled framework that has been imposed upon them. But I suppose that's quite a complex conversation in other jurisdictions. In Australia, my fear is that the word recognition kind of gives rise to, I suppose, an assumption that that is a symbolic form of recognition. And I think that's what's happened in the intervening period since the expert panel, is that people think recognition just means recognition, which is a kind of poetical form of words in the Constitution that recognises a particular group and the manifestations of that culture. But that's certainly not why I joined the expert panel. It was for some form of substantive recognition, something that would change or shift some of the problems within the public structures in Australia. And that is and that means dealing with issues of power. And I suppose the word recognition, in my mind, the debate has kind of gone down a track where a lot of non-Indigenous people think it is about symbolism. That's a huge problem to me. The other issue that I think has arisen in the intervening period since the expert panel handed down its report is the issue of hyperbole or unrealistic expectations. So we're told that recognition will lead to a unified nation, that it will improve race relations. So there's many overblown statements about what recognition can achieve. And I think that this iteration, I think it is one of many to come. I mean, I've heard people say that recognition will close the circle of colonisation, or it will deal with these issues, and the morning after the referendum we'll wake up and we'll be a reconciled and unified nation. Well, actually, when you look at the history of settler states and Indigenous peoples, that's an ongoing conversation. It never ends. I mean, how can it end? So it really is only one step, and I suppose I get worried at the overblown statements about what it is that recognition can achieve. And there's a lot of, and that does set up unrealistic expectations. The other issue, I suppose, tangential to that is what happens next. We're told, so for example, yesterday I think Frank Brennan released his latest book, who's saying, we're overreaching, we shouldn't be asking for anything other than symbolic recognition in the Constitution. And he says if we just go with symbolism, then we can build upon that. But that's really problematic to me, because in 1967 we had this amazing referendum, huge majority, and nothing happened for about 5 years, I think it was, leading up to the Whitlam government. But I mean, obviously Whitlam was spurred on by the Tan Embassy and the activism from Aboriginal people. So I think it's really dangerous also to suggest that, you do this, then we'll have a conversation about a treaty, or you do this and then we'll have a conversation about sovereignty. I think that's problematic too. If you're going to say that, then come out with a proposal or a process by which that might be achieved, but just don't say to people, the next step will be a treaty, or the next step, you need this step to deal with sovereignty. I think that's really flawed. I won't talk too much about the committee that's refining the model, because I suspect that the report that the committee is going to come down with is not unlike the expert panel. The next quick point I want to make is the debate over, set the date. So people are really pushing for the referendum to be held in 2017 at the 50th anniversary of 1967. And I'm starting to become really increasingly frustrated at that suggestion. This iteration of recognition bears absolutely zero resemblance to 1967. 1967 is an entirely different part of our history. It was a grassroots movement. You know, it was aunties and uncles and grandmas and grandfathers around a cup of tea around the table. It was about a very specific thing. There was a very clear idea or model from the outset, which was to amend 5126. That's really super significant, I think. So, you know, there's a lot of pressure on Tony Abbott and previously Gillard to set the date for 2017. But in my mind, that puts us Aboriginal people at a disadvantage because we're in the weaker bargaining position. If you set the date and you haven't set a model, all that is going to do is set us up in a position where we're going to have to compromise and settle for something that we're not happy with. So I'm not keen on, it may be the case that we will resolve this issue before 2017, I don't know. What I do know as a constitutional lawyer is that nowhere in the history of Australia or Australian referendums have we set a date for a referendum before we've had a question or a model. So why would we do it with something so critical as Aboriginal recognition? Makes zero sense to me. The last point I want to make, without dominating the entire forum, is what I call the counter-narrative. So there's a narrative of let's recognise you. I've already made the point about the, I suppose, problems with the word recognition, which gives rise to conversations in the mainstream community that this is just about symbolism. And I think I know from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community that they don't just want symbolism, they want something substantive. That's what we want, that's why we're here. But there's a counter-narrative, which is policies, funding cuts, legislation at state and territory levels, which really strike at the heart of our culture. In fact, some amendments to some acts aimed at obliterating those aspects of our culture. How can you possibly, at a national level, move to recognition of our culture, while on the other hand, in law and policy, in language, in press conferences, undermine those really important manifestations of our culture? So I think there's a counter-narrative there, and I think people are bewildered when they're like, oh, white Australia's really on board with recognition, but Aboriginal Australia isn't. Well, that's probably the reason. The Indigenous Advancement Strategy, for example, has gutted the sector. I mean, it's true that some organisations have had their funding reinstated, but a lot of organisations haven't. And now the so-called Aboriginal industry is predominantly non-Indigenous, not-for-profit sector, and public departments want money under Indigenous Advancement Strategy. So the point I'm making is there's a counter-narrative there. You want to recognise this, but at the same time, you know, all of the decisions that you are making are undermining our culture and who we are as a people. And I think that makes this a very difficult time to be prosecuting this, which I still think is very important, mind you. As a member of the expert panel at that time, and we did the core substantive issue was section 116A, which was addressing racial discrimination in the Constitution. You know, we felt very strongly about that. We did provide 2 chapters on treaty and sovereignty, but obviously the feedback from the community was that was unsatisfactorily dealt with. And so I suppose maybe the point we're at is one by which, and I know there's a number of leaders calling for Aboriginal conventions, by which perhaps we need to engage in a new process of reconciliation. And when I talk about reconciliation, I'm not talking about provision of jobs or citizenship rights or RAPs. I'm talking about what most reconciliation processes are around the world, and that is about truth and justice. That's what they're about. I always say to my colleagues, there's a reason why the Australian reconciliation process is cited in virtually no scholarly literature in the world, because it's just never been about truth and justice. And Australians may or may not be ready to have those difficult conversations. But I'm not going to be one of those people who support this going forward. That's just about symbolism, which for me is just, would be disingenuous given a lot of the very recent developments in law and policy pertaining to Indigenous rights. So I suppose the last point I would make is that I think most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders who've been involved in this space realise that we've entirely lost the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, and that we need to re-engage that community in a process that might involve conventions, that might involve other things. But I'm certainly very happy to be here tonight because I don't think there's enough of these kinds of really honest conversations going on. I think it's all very controlled. There's a lot of PR going on, and this is a great opportunity to have those kinds of conversations, no matter how difficult they are. That's.
Thanks, Megan. I think you've addressed nearly every question, but we might expand on some of those later. Like, we're done.
Sorry.
That's okay. Bo, I will hand over to you and just summarise some of the conversations that each participant here have had, because I know not everyone's been able to make it. But Bo, you discussed at length your reasons against the Recognise campaign in favour of focusing our collective consciousness to the sovereignty movement. You believe that constitutional recognition will slow down the sovereignty movement. Can you tell us how you think the campaigning around constitutional recognition will harm or is harming the sovereignty movement?
I just think, it's taken away, a big space from having a discussion, of who we really are, because having a discussion around Recognise and about the Constitution, it's really about a question of, do you want to be Australian, or do you want to be Aboriginal, or do you want to be Gomeroi or Gurrumpul or Yagara? Like we've got to understand first about what position we're coming from and who we are, to come up with a more national understanding of where we want to go. And it's about asking who we really are. Do we identify as being some of our mob identify as being Australian Aboriginals, or would you rather be an Aboriginal Australian? And like these are the things that we've got to start discussing. And we could miss the ball heaps, just like South Africa did. With this whole truth and reconciliation thing they had when Mandela came in. They like the way they missed the ball is like the economical bill that they could have had to get the blacks out of slums, put them in positions to educate themselves and find out real ways to empower themselves and educate themselves. So then when we have a discussion on a national basis like this, we can be ready to answer questions when they come up to what does it want. We can be a nation that just like Scotland recently just spoke about independence. Like I think it was 40-60 the vote for independence, and about 40% of that nation of Scottish people wanted to be wanted to be an independent nation from the British Crown. Like we've got to start to really identify with who we want to be, and that's when it comes back to nation building. When we start the nation build, then we can come back to a question of how do we see our nation, where do we see ourselves, or like the question of sovereignty needs to be answered also by non-Indigenous peoples in how they see the sovereignty of Aboriginal people and how they feel comfortable with identifying that. And also it comes back to that thing of being genuine about who we are, and actually identifying that they live on Yagara country or Turrbal country, and when they make that understanding, they make an understanding not of an Australian, but of an ally, of Indigenous peoples, coming from an understanding, because it is a two-way street of understanding. But first and foremost, we've got to build, that collective consciousness of our people, to have, a big debate, such as this, because at the moment, like this debate, if we've had enough time, to formally educate our people, should be in communities like Inala, Woodridge, places like Redfern, Mount Druitt, Fitzroy, like these are where the discussions need to be, because that's where the majority of our peoples are, and I think, it's about understanding who we are, first and foremost, and then, asking a question later down the track, you know, do we identify with being, you know, an Australian Aboriginal or an Aboriginal Australian?
Mark, you also spoke, similar to Bo, about this two-way understanding that we need to develop, but in a slightly different way. You spoke of constitutional recognition, that whole process of having to take Australia through its own history might lead to a more expedient process for the sovereignty movement. Can you tell us how the Recognise campaign itself is addressing the call for sovereignty from the communities?
Okay, well I guess there's a response that comes from the campaign, and there's a response in which I, as an individual, also wrestle with these ideas as well.
Yeah.
From a campaign point of view, the relationship with matters of sovereignty and also matters of treaty, but they're quite separate things. But the relationship is that the push towards getting recognition within the Constitution doesn't thwart, it doesn't block, it doesn't set up a hindrance to sovereignty being addressed by our people. That's one thing, though, from a campaign point of view. But just from the other point of view, I just want to say that I agree with Bo. What this raises is, for us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we have to then start asking ourselves the question, how do I really sit with my relationship with the construct of Australia, the nation of Australia? Am I more Gamilaroi, or am I more, you know, Birugaba? Am I more that? Or am I more Australian? How do I, or Queensland, you know, we have state of origin, you know, and all of a sudden all of this conversation just disappears because you become either maroon or blue. But in a real sense, it is about allegiance. It is about allegiance saying that represents who I am. That represents what I believe in. And for us, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, this becomes a conversation about our future. Yes, there is a Recognise campaign which is pursuing things that are very technical and specific in one sense. And I take your point, Megan, that we can't put the hyperbole around it because there's hyperbole on both sides. One side saying this could be the flowering moment of our thing, and I'm part of that conversation that says this can punctuate our history for better. But then there's the other one, which is like, let's not do this because it won't be all that we live up to. It won't provide enough of a momentum shift for the conversation, or we're going to give the blackfellas too much. So there's a conversation out there as well, and I think it's better and more worthwhile to be pursuing an ultimately positive agenda that will have Australians, have Indigenous peoples recognised in that document, in the Australian Constitution, because it will provide us an opportunity for momentum in moving forward, given that we don't want to overdress it and overpromise it, but it will strike. And I think the recognition of this, or the realisation of a platform like this, is in part the reality that we haven't had a national dialogue on almost anything for the last 10 years. And at the moment, it's an hour, but you know, in many ways, we've had national challenges and problems for the last decade since the abolition of ATSIC.
Yeah, and I think that's been a common theme that's come through the discussions, is the challenges that we've faced and how can we have this conversation while we're having the kind of policy and political problems that we're having. Before I jump into that question, did you want to respond to something?
Oh yeah, you know, like just like acknowledging, you know, already, you know, like Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, you know, have, you know, amended their state constitutions to recognise Aboriginal people, you know, and it's just to understand, you know, like when we wake up, you know, like if we wake up after the amendments and, you know, it's changed and there's a vote for yes and then they change it, you know, like nothing's really going to like formally change in terms of our situation, you know, and like that's what we're going to understand is, you know, when we wake up, you know, after the vote is yes or no, you know, like we're still going to be in that same situation, you know, and it's how we address that, you know, and that's just, and like at the moment that's leaving, you know, a blank space, you know, because when we talk about sovereignty, when we talk about independence, even constitutional recognition, they're in this big circle right here, that's an end goal, you know, what's these steps in the middle to get there, you know, like we all know, like we all know that how to take these steps, but it's how many steps we're going to take to get to that door up there, you know, and like, you know, and like that's just waking up, you know, in 2017, realising, you know, everybody voted yes, is what is it really going to change?
And what's beyond that as well?
Can I just make one point tangential to what Bo just said, and that is the recognition in the constitutions of New South Wales, South Australia.
Oh.
Victoria and Queensland, I think. The problem with that, and I know it's routinely cited as being a positive thing, is that each of them have a no legal effect clause, which as a lawyer and as an Aboriginal person I find hugely offensive. And that is because state constitutions are just ordinary acts of legislation. They're not like the Australian Constitution, which is a double entrenched constitution, which means any subsequent act could override the recognition of Aboriginal people, which means they didn't need to have a no legal effect clause. When we were on the expert panel, we travelled around in New South Wales, Queensland, were boasting about it, but even the expert panel in their report were hugely offended by the fact that there were no legal effect clauses in that recognition. I call that kind of recognition the kind of recognition that you have when you're not having recognition. So I actually don't find that at all recognition. Yeah. I think it's really gutless, personally. And that's why the expert panel did recommend that if you were going to have some form of recognition of the Constitution, you cannot have a no legal effect clause, because Aboriginal people find that offensive. And it means that you're pretending to recognise culture when you're actually not. Sorry, I just had to make that point, because I know people cite the state constitutions, but it's, they're just ordinary acts of parliament. It's not, they didn't need a no legal effect clause.
We've just got a question from the audience. Yes, just here.
Look, I'm Netta and I'm an Aboriginal Australian. I would like to know why you're including the Torres Strait Islanders in this constitution when they're indigenous to the Torres Straits as well as they're from the Melanesian descent. So why are they being put in the constitution with us? One you must know, you are all jumping up and down for our rights.
Pardon me. The presence of Torres Strait Islander with Aboriginal people here in Australia.
Here, no, don't start that here. Why did you come and took our land now you're giving them away? Make up your mind what you want to do. You're carrying our flags when you're marching. Aboriginal land always was and always will be. It's not going to be because you're giving it away.
To the Torres Strait.
I mean, fair is fair.
Yeah, but it's a recognition that Torres Strait is part of Australia.
What did I just say to you? The Torres Strait Islanders are indigenous to the Torres Strait. They are not indigenous to Australia.
So, yeah, okay.
And if you're all doing the Constitution for it, you better go and learn your history.
Yeah, well, I mean, the point is, it's true they're a part of the Australian political and legal system.
Well, what's that
and
got to do with anything?
The recognition is for First Peoples of Australia, which includes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
So what was that?
The recognition is for the recognition of the Indigenous peoples of Australia. That includes Aboriginal people, and it also includes Torres Strait Islander people.
Yeah, we're not included in the Torres Strait Islands. Is any of our flags hanging up there?
Is there a resource?
No, don't start. You want to get your history right if you're going to talk on our behalf.
Yeah, so I think that what Megan was saying is that it's part of the legal construct is that Torres Strait falls under Australia, so that's why they're included in this particular construct.
I just raise that to me seems like a really important question for if we move more and more towards sovereignty as our reality.
Well, look what you got for sovereignty up there, Aboriginal people.
Yeah, so the more we move towards us being able to define ourselves as a people, we're going to face that real question, where Aboriginal people right across Australia will say, okay, we didn't annex the Torres Strait as Aboriginal people, we traded with them, the Northern Mob traded with them for thousands of years, but we never annexed them, the Australian government did. So are we going to, so that question is not for this moment, that question is for the moment when we start defining our boundaries and borders as sovereign people.
Well, I think a lot of that's already been done, and that is the High Court's recognition of native title. So that was over a part of the Torres Strait, which then applied to the rest of Australia. So, I mean, that's why a lot of Aboriginal people say they don't want the symbolic recognition part, because the High Court's already provided that recognition in its decision in Mabo, and that's quite a compelling argument too.
Okay. We have two more questions and then we'll open the discussion again up to the floor. I know we touched on this earlier, But I know throughout the conversations from the audience, there's been a constant theme of people being rather apprehensive of the government's support of constitutional recognition in light of ongoing concerns over policy where communities are being potentially shut down, the cuts to the funding that you mentioned. We've also seen in the past government give support to the treaty movement and broken promises consistently. Given the history and the current political climate, how can Australia or even the government possibly ready for constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? And do you believe that there's any hidden agendas there?
I'll have a crack. I was just reading like this yellow part in the second and third dot point in it, you know, and it says to preserve Commonwealth power to make laws to respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, you know, making laws to understand, you know, such a power to prevent Commonwealth from discriminating, you know, like with a law like that, that's what they took out in 2007, you know, to implement, you know, the intervention, you know, and at the moment with the WA communities, they're saying, you know, a lot of these families are neglecting their you know, a lot of the parents are neglecting the children, you know, so they want to go in there, you know, there's funding cuts, you know, so with, you know, like with no services up there, you know, this is going to create, you know, neglect from families because, you know, there's no services, you know, to employ people, you know, for, you know, basic health net there, you know, and, you know, they're going to turn around and do the exact same, you know, within, you know, when they went into the NT, you know, and it's been almost 10 years, you know, and the Northern Territory intervention is still going, you know, under, I think it's Stronger Futures, you know, you know, like, and then they, you know, like they remove it in one section and they put it back in, you know, and they word it very nicely, you know, so I think it's, you know, like we've got to understand, you know, the words that we're reading, you know, in front of us because they can be really deceiving as well, and understand, you know, like that one right there, you know, they're making these laws and with such power to, you know, to prevent, you know, the Commonwealth from making scrutiny, you know, our laws, you know, and you know, like in section, you know, in section, I think it's 51A, they remove, you know, the race power card, but then in section 51, section 51, they remove the, you know, like the race power card, you know, then in section 51A, I think it is, they put it back in, you know, under, you know, wording of, you know, for the benefit of Aboriginal people, you know, so they're going to go into these communities in Western Australia, you know, you know, for the benefit, you know, because there's no resources there, you know, there's no services there, you know, so they're going to up and move these, you know, our mob out of there, you know, so it's, you know, once again, you know, trying to understand the wording, you know, of some of the stuff, you know, that's coming out.
And so you think it's directly related to current policy, and you think the push for constitutional recognition, that's directly related?
Oh,
yeah.
Well, you know, like in 2007, they just took it straight out, you know, and what's not to say they're going to do it again, you know, if they're going to be removing, you know, 150 communities in WA, what's not to say that, you know, they're not going to do it in any other state as well, you know, that's with or without, you know, any legislation or act or law, they just do it, you know.
That's been a common theme coming through each conversation.
Yeah.
Mark, do you have
Well,
any response?
well, first of all, I just think that the reality of a forum like this is to allow for this kind of, for the healthy debate, for the healthy exchange, because it's unhealthy and it's unhelpful when it becomes a vindictive crossfire.
Yeah.
Because what happens is that our people get caught in that crossfire, and you know, we get people called for all sorts of things because of what we perceive to be the government's agenda, whether we know it yes or no. You know, so I've got an opinion on what I think, and rather than work towards how do we address that by, you know, shooting messages, and that's one of the things that's absent from this sort of forum, which is great. I think the reality of having these kinds of exchanges it's powerful because of that. The scepticism for the governments at state and federal level, I've always encouraged people around community as part of the journey work that I've done, as part of engagements in forums like this, to remain sceptical. I think scepticism is an important way that we can not take for granted the freedom that we have here in the country, but also not take for granted and not take the sweets that get sold to us and go, oh, thanks for that. We should ask really critical questions. We should say, so what else? And what about that other bit over there? And what's going on with that? How does that all line up? How can you... That to me means that we remain healthy, skepticism. The part that I want us to not fall into is to become cynical.
Yeah.
Because cynicism doesn't help us move forward. Cynicism doesn't help us to make progress. Cynicism would say to me that I cannot trust the white man. Cynicism would say to me that I cannot trust any government. Why? Because I look at their track record. That's what I would say as a cynic. So I can remain skeptical at what's going on and go, look, we still need to do, this is very messy. All of it's messy and it's critical and it affects and impacts our future. Not just as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, but as an Australian. We will look very bad and this will be no good for us if this goes nowhere. We've got to propel this conversation to be more substantive, to be better for us as a country. In order to do that, I've got to partner with that messiness. I've got to work with the messiness that says, man, I don't know how to solve the situation in WA. I don't know how to do it. And there's much better minds than me are trying to solve that situation. You know, I could easily, ring up Tony and say, hey, Tony, can you just transfer some money across those WA's community? I can't do that. You know, and it's not something that can be solved by one phone call. So I guess the point I'm making there is that in this messy environment, it's critical, it's messy, and it's difficult. If I don't lean in with an attitude of, I've got to wrestle with this messiness and try and make something better, then I'm going to lean back and I'm going to say, no, I'm going to wait till the country's better. I'm going to wait until our funding is better. I'm going to wait until our consciousness as a country around racism is better. I'm going to wait until we've got better instruments. I'm going to wait until we've got a more good-looking government or whatever. You know, I'm going to wait for some sort of better path, smoother road. The reality is that road's not there. That road's not coming. So I've got to deal with the messy, tough, difficult terrain which is right now, which includes part of the stuff that would make me think, man, this is tough. And I said in my, when I was talking to the group in the other room that part of the thing is that we have to carry that. We have to carry the messiness and face the reality of saying, it's when I sit across the table from organisations that have been defunded, that's a very difficult conversation to have, because then I'm then asking them to say, we have to believe in something that's bigger and better than this, don't we? And they're like, yeah, but it'd be nice to not have to do industrial action and tell people they can't have a job after July. That sort of stuff is tough. But my response to that is that we've still got to lean in and try and find a way to work this opportunity, this momentum, for it to be used for a positive outcome, and not lean back and wait for some better environment to show itself.
Yeah, I've got a number of points to make on that. I mean, the first point, I take exception to Mark's comment that we will look very bad if this goes nowhere. I really don't like that position, because I feel like, again, it's putting our mob into a corner where we're going to feel like we have to compromise. You say we must lean in, we must engage with this messiness. That's what we do. That's what we do as a mob in our communities, day in, day out, since forever. And I don't think we don't ever do that. But I don't think we'll look bad if, for example, we didn't like the offer on the table. I think mobs should be entitled to walk away. I think that's an equally sophisticated position as it is to stepping up to the plate and compromising. To be perfectly honest, I think that cynicism is fine. I'm a very cynical person. I've read everything there is to read on referendums and the Constitution, and I think cynicism is probably a very healthy, robust approach. I also think tension and fiery debate is important and healthy too. I mean, that's what resistance is. I don't think this just has to be, and I'm not, I think it needs to be civil, but I don't think it has to be, a kind of Pollyanna tiptoe through the tulips type approach to Aboriginal affairs, because we're a very, very complex community. We represent many, many different communities all across the country, and that is really the big task of this, is how to mobilise everybody to get to a point where we agree on something. And what we agree on might be to walk away. And I think there's a lot of literature and op-eds being written that this will be terrible for race relations if this doesn't get up. Well, can we do an analysis of race relations now? I mean, I mean, I just think that there's so, I just really worry about the huge amount of pressure being put on mob in this space. As I said, to accept something that they're not, they just don't want. So I agree with what you're saying in terms of partner with the messiness, but, you know, I think we do that anyway. But I really, really do think that things like Western Australia's closure of communities or Northern Territory's potential closure of communities, or Western Australia's outrageous amendments to the Heritage Act, I think they are absolutely 100% relevant to this. I don't think that you can be an Aboriginal person in this space and look at the advocacy for recognition of our culture and our heritage and our land and our peoples in the Constitution and not be moved by what's going on in different states and territories around the country. I think it absolutely 100% influences the way people feel about this, including IAS. Like I said, the funding cuts have just cut at the heart of our sector, and I think we all know that the Indigenous sector is now actually predominantly a non-Indigenous sector. I think they're absolutely connected. Bo's point is a really sophisticated point, which is about the substantive change to the Constitution. And I think the point that you're making is really correct. I mean, I think in 2007 they suspended, they disallowed the Racial Discrimination Act so that it could pass discriminatory legislation. And I suppose the expert panel came just off the back of that. So that was very forefront of our minds, which was how do you prevent discrimination in the Constitution? Because the key issue is that we have a race power in the Constitution, 5126, and I'm sure I don't have to tell everybody this, but it provides the federal parliament to make laws for Aboriginal people or people of any race. So it doesn't say Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, people of any race, but it doesn't say whether those laws should be good laws or bad laws, positive laws or negative laws. And the High Court has interpreted it as saying it absolutely supports negative laws. So I suppose part of what we were doing was to try and ameliorate that. But Bo's made a very sophisticated point, which is the replacement power still may enable those kinds of discriminatory laws because the High Court is tasked with the job of making a decision as to, well, who says they're discriminatory? Is it the community? Is it the government? Is it for their welfare? Is it not? Really doesn't matter if you put benefit or advancement in there. That helps the court do their work, but they're going to go through that kind of process anyway. So I think the point that you're making is is an important one. But that's the kind of discussion that we really need to have, and I think that echoes what Mark was saying. We need to have more of these discussions, a lot more of these discussions where we can really, look at some of the changes, because they are very complex and they do hurt your head. They're hard to understand, and we need people to kind of grapple with them, because otherwise we're going to be sold something that we don't want.
Just want to clarify there. I wouldn't want for any misinterpretation. I don't believe that we already engage in the messiness. We're absolutely right. We absolutely already do. The point I was making there is that for us to sit back and wait for something, a better environment, and not engage in this where it is at the moment, that's the part. And to walk away now because of what is happening, that to me is because we don't have the model. We don't have the question in front of us. But if we were to walk away right now and say, because of those things that I can see there, I now not trust you. I'm now not going to do anything. Yeah. And the other part to this is that we're speaking in a way that we've got a coordinated, coherent, Aboriginal connected voice that's going on. The reality is we don't. The reality is we've got lots of different voices trying to make the best way that they can way forward. And so that includes people who are trying to work within the Recognise campaign, people who are working on the alternatives to Recognise campaign, people who are just wanting to make some sense of the situation. So,
well, Recognise is at a disadvantage because there is no model, which is why so many Indigenous people don't support it, because they're supporting a kind of amorphous idea, but there's no model.
There's no model. And
all three panellists have brilliantly pointed out the importance of having a healthy debate and discussion, and we are at that point in the evening where we want to open that discussion up to everyone here. Eleanor and Kayla are running around with microphones, so if you have a question for all panelists or a specific person on the panel, now's the time to ask. If you could just pop your hand up. Right off the back, Nadine.
Hi. Do you think that between now and the proposed 2017 deadline that there
That's
would
not a
be...
deadline. It's a contrived date.
But do you think there would be any possibility that the Recognise campaign would now opt for a different process of being able to inform our community of the changes? Because it's conversations like this that happen in auditoriums like this and then out, down at Musgrave and around the place that are happening at that grassroots level that you spoke really clearly about at the beginning of the night. But it's how does Recognise see its place in that movement? How does it see itself in the conversation with our mob at that level? And would they do it, start changing their model of working?
Yeah, so at the moment, the charge, the scope of work that Recognise is determined to do as an organisation is to raise awareness and support for this process. Once the model is released, the game changes and it becomes a campaign. And then the campaign, and maybe you can elaborate, I'd like for you to actually elaborate on this meeting, around what happens when you go through those formal steps of referendum change where the question gets put, the model gets set and the time frame to the actual date. Now just to make it super clear, and Megan's already said, it's not set, the date is not set, and yes, the Prime Minister is under some pressure to set a date, but nobody wants it to go, well, so I shouldn't say nobody, but it would be incorrect for it to go the wrong way around, for the date to be set, and then everyone fall into line, because I agree with Megan, then that puts us all as Australians under increasing pressure, but particularly blackfellas, under excruciating pressure to make it work. So the process is, the question will be placed. Now the Joint Select Committee have until 30 June to have their report out, and then once the question is then put to us as the model is out, and the model is out there for public consumption and public debate, that begins then a process of campaign. And the Yes campaign will have their support, and the No campaign will have their support. And that's where the game shifts. But as far as Recognise is concerned, our role is up until that point in how we promote awareness and for 20 million Australians and support for this, because of what we believe. So the other part to that then is the constraint. So what Recognise can't do is Recognise can't say we support it, and then there's also this other voice and we want to give them equal place as well. That's not Recognise's job. But forums like this allow for that to happen. And Recognise has always said we want to be here for these conversations. These debates are important for our community. But our role is to also run this line out here. Now that can be quite a difficult line, as you can appreciate, but that's our line, that's our role. And so the more work that gets done with others is critical. It's critical for raising the consciousness of all of us. We become smarter when we engage in this debate. We don't get dull. We become smarter, and that's why we've got to do this. We'll get dull if we just get one voice. So that's why this sort of forum is super important. But we Recognise change the way it interacts with the community? Probably not, because we're reacting and engaging with the community all the time, which I think is a great job as far as the organisation is concerned. I think the processes are great. However, there's a limitation to that. And the question around how far we can reach, we've got to reach not only to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, but we have to reach every RSL, every country club, every sector of Australia to try and get them to go, oh yeah, this seems like a good idea, it's good enough, this will be a good thing for us, let's go for this.
So at the end of the expert panel process, we recommended that they set up a campaign arm to keep the momentum going, and that's what Recognise is. So, I suspect, I know Recognise will have to sell whatever the model is, and that will be an interesting conversation later down the track. If say, for example, it was symbolism, Recognise is still going to have to sell that, and that's going to come up against some sort of tension with our community that I suspect will not support that. But that's why there's a lot of, so Recognise is a kind of taxpayer funded campaign arm. So if we just put them to that side, that's what kind of discussion going on, and it's been in the press a bit lately, that there'll be Aboriginal conventions that are held around the country that engages the Aboriginal community. So that might still occur because you know, you guys have got, Recognise has got the expert panel recs and recommendations, but as I said at the beginning of my statement, there's an obvious, a very kind of entrenched, I would say, resistance to constitution. Let's not call it Recognise, let's call it constitutional reform, because I think people conflate Recognise and reform, and they're two different things. So I think there is a kind of resistance to reform at the moment for obvious reasons, which we've discussed. WA, IAS, lots of reasons. In addition to people just being really, I suppose, disappointed that we're not engaging with questions of treaty and sovereignty. And, you know, and I speak regularly to a lot of people who are on the expert panel and other leaders on the constitutional question, and I think everybody's starting to say, well, maybe we need to develop a process by which we can come to a final settlement. And we haven't, we haven't done that. We had the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation. We had a really important social justice package, which was the third arm of the settlement from Mabo, and that social justice package hasn't been implemented, which part of that was about a settlement. How do you work towards addressing the unfinished business of sovereignty and treaty? So there's these kind of counter conversations going on all around the community, and I think perhaps if the government does agree to those Indigenous conventions, that they might be a really useful way of moving us closer to where we want to be. And I mean, I think as Mark said, we're a very diverse community. There's you know, so many different communities around the country that don't all agree on different things, and different communities are at different stages of nation building. So you know, in 1983, the Constitutional Commission recommended a provision in the Constitution for treaties, by which the idea being, once you've negotiated a treaty in your particular area with your local government and federal government, state government, then it would get registered in the Constitution later on. And all our communities are at different levels of that in terms of being close to some sort of settlement. So since the expert panel, I think the kinds of conversations around treaty and sovereignty have been really helpful and have really, although I mean maybe the committee hasn't quite responded to them, I think a lot of our leaders around the country have you know, taken that on board, and I suspect that's part of, I think Noel Pearson has recommended a kind of parliamentary body, and I think a part of that body is kind of aimed at addressing some of those concerns, which part of that body's role would be to facilitate the kind of settlement around the country on land and other matters. But anyway, I think a lot of people are aware of your concerns, and we're trying to work around a way of dealing with those.
There's a consistent question coming up. Another one here.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. Really interesting discussion. I think that my question is mostly for Bo, although I'd welcome anyone's contributions from the audience as well. But I also happen to be deeply cynical about the state and its involvement in Indigenous affairs in Australia. And I know that there's a lot of organising and a lot of conversations are going on amongst different Aboriginal communities and Torres Strait Islander communities that don't seek to engage with the state, but seek to bypass it, and that some of those movements are having really exciting successes at the moment. So I think that might be a valuable part of the conversation as well. Is just, I'd love it if Bo could describe where those movements are at the moment. Yeah.
I guess, like if we sat down and put all those movements, together, they'd agree on one thing, is that, we're not Australian, we're our nations, you know, and like I think that's, you know, like where it's got to start from. But yeah, you know, like you have the, you know, the like the independence of like the Murray Republic, you know, down there in North New South Wales, you know, which is talking about, you know, starting up their own although they've already started their own constitution, you know, and all these different things, you know, and like declare their independence, you know, they're going to have their own flag, you know, you know, there's the other movement with, you know, people like Michael Manson developing, you know, Aboriginal passports. You know, Debbie, you know, one of my daddy's sister girls I went to Canada with last year, she just came back from the Solomon Islands, you know, they stamped, you know, the Aboriginal passport, you know, but Australia didn't, you know, when she came back. You know, then you've got, you know, people, you know, like it's a massive movement out there, you know, but the biggest challenge is facilitating one big discussion of, you know, where we all could go, you know, and that's the whole point of, you know, having, you know, this yarn at the moment, you know, is about, you know, putting us all, you know, in one seat and not separate seats to understand that, you know, like to get up, you know, to all these stairs, you know, like we can all move as one to get, you know, further closer to that there, you know, but like in that question, you know, it, yeah, you know, like I was saying, it comes back to, you know, like when we do sit down, you know, we sit down, we say, you know, we identify, you know, with who we are, you know, and like that's our biggest movement, you know, where we're being successful, you know, and behind that there, you know, is things like the Aboriginal flag, you know, a nation, you know, all of us people, you know, will sit behind that flag, you know, and identify that regardless, you know, of our political and social, economical, you know, views and status, you know, like we'll say that there, you know, like we need to, you know, build around, like we need to build around something, you know, such as the Aboriginal flag that brings people together, you know, regardless of, individual, races, you know, because that's where it can be seen at the moment as well, you know, with a lot of movements, you know, people think that, you know, it's, you know, like everybody has an answer, you know, but the hardest thing is, you know, sitting down together and having that discussion, you know, which, you know, I guess ends up, you know, being the easiest thing to understand. Yeah, you know, like there's, like, you know, like there's the sovereignty movement, if that's what I want to call it, you know, is growing, you know, day in, day out, you know, especially, you know, on the back of things like, you know, the removal of these communities and that there, and like at those, you know, pivotal times, that's when we need to ask, you know, this question of, you know, independence or, you know, of treaty, recognition, whatever, you know, that question is, you know, we need to, you know, ask it and facilitate it, you know, to our people, you know, in a much, you know, I guess more comfortable, backdrop, you know, where our people feel, you know, more open in that they, you know, because, you know, sometimes it can take out of, you know, like discussions like this, it can be, you know, taken away from, you know, our community, you know, when they're, you know, held, you know, in different backgrounds, you know, and that in itself, you know, takes away from the discussion also, you know, when we're talking about, you know, like the whole sovereignty movements out there. It's about, you know, making our mob feel comfortable and understanding, you know, to have, you know, a discussion about, you know, all these things.
And just quickly, because it was something that I know came up in the conversation with you. My understanding of sovereignty is that it can look like different things to different people. What does sovereignty look like for you, Bo?
I guess, you know, first and foremost, it's me identifying with who I am, where I come from, you know, and it's, you know, everybody on here acknowledging, you know, who I am, you know, and that in itself, you know, isn't, you know, a clause or a, you know, or a, you know, an act or legislation, you know, or, you know, it's an act, you know, within itself, you know, towards, you know, our relationships, you know, as nations with each other. You know, so yes, sovereignty is, you know, like you're saying, like you ask different people, you know, and you get 10 different answers. You know, to me, it's my birthright and it's my responsibility, you know, to help facilitate and inform, you know, on any front, you know, in any discussion, you know, which we're having like right now.
Thank you.
I guess, Bo, that was my question as well. Exactly what is sovereignty is probably one of the questions I wanted to ask tonight. I know that when you were talking about when Scottish people wanted to get sovereignty from the British flag, like they had to talk about there's money, like they have to talk about government, they have to talk about all these different systems that they have to put in place. And you're talking about just letting known, where you come from. Is there any talk about all of the other steps that need to be involved in that? Will that set us back? Because we have to, put in place all of these other levels of government and education, as well as, it's setting up a whole world, really.
That's it, and like the discussion, for our, like our discussion for our independence, or our movement for independence, has been, continuing, since like 1788, but I guess in the last 10 years, 20 years, with the big discussion around treaty, and then that went away, it comes back, to sorry, just mind blank. I just went out of my head. Sorry. What was the? Just straight out of my head. Well, could you just say that again, sis?
So it's about all the other systems that we have to put in place.
Yeah, that's it. Like that's something, regardless of whether our situation at the moment, whether we fail at it, what's not to say that those things are not going to happen, because like the last 20 years for us to get treaty and sovereignty out there, this whole big push for it. At the first hurdle, this is what they're going to say, is hey, you just failed your people. Then we just come back and say, we've never had a chance to actually sit down, and govern our own societies, for the last 250 years, failing, or getting knocked back is something that's going to happen regardless, of our situation. It's going to be hard, but at the same time, like we have, mob, nowadays, that have, degrees out there, that can step into those positions, and look, we've got to be willing, to step in those positions, whether or not, there's a paycheck there, and to understand how bad that, we want this, like in regards to what happened in Scotland, 30,000, Scottish people marched, in early 2013 or towards the end of 2012, 30,000 people marched, because they wanted to be, recognised as an independent country. Recently, with stuff, with what's happening with the closures, I think there's, estimated around 30, or 20,000 people that marched around this country. Like we've got to come back and get ready, not just to sit back on a single issue, but, come back, and be prepared, to step into roles, to be teachers, to be doctors, to be lawyers, to set up, what we want to set up, and I think that's the biggest fear with, setting up, like an independent status, how we're going to have our law, how we're going to have money, how we're going to, facilitate schools and all these things, but, in terms of, getting, to that, it's a discussion that we're going to have, and we've got to be ready to, or like we've got to be willing to see how far we want to push it, to get to that point. But like that's another like that's going to come in time, when we're all ready and united.
I just like to make a comment on that. In the modern era of decolonisation, starting from India, saying British, you can leave here. That sort of stuff happening in 1946. From that era, one of the common things cited is the work that was done in Algeria, where the French were saying, but if you take back your country, you're going to have all these problems. You're going to have this problem, that problem, that problem, that problem. And the profound response from the Algerians was to say, yes, but they'll be our problems, and they'll be no longer your concerns. Now that was terrific and profound and proper in that era of decolonising, Go back, get away from us, colonising power, we're going to be autonomous and run our own country, and these problems will now be ours.
Yeah.
Our situation here is much more different to that. And one of our challenges is that we're still going to have to deal with the reality of the population of Australia and what is here around us. And so we're going to have to deal with some really pivotal and critical questions like that. How are we going to relate to things like providing power and water and sewage and all that sort of stuff? And we can think about that. I mean, we're going to have to think about that at some point. But for me, one of the things that's clear around that this is not a recognised versus sovereignty dialogue debate. This is just to make sure that the conversation about recognition, constitutional reform, which currently is branded in this form, but constitutional reform is one light on a future for Australia. There is other stuff that is happening. And if I hear Bo correctly, it's about saying that's not the only conversation that blackfellas are interested in. And part of the tension, if there is tension, is the tension to say, let's not just talk about constitutional recognition, let's also talk about other stuff that we want to pursue. And that's something that we have to do as Indigenous Australians, Indigenous people, Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander mob, all of us as particular groups. But we still have to then have a conversation with everyone else that lives here about what they perceive as the future that they want to have as well. How do they want to relate to the first peoples of this land? And so while we're busy trying to form together our internal structures and get internal integrity amongst our own people, while we're doing that, we've still got our neighbours, our fellow Australians at the moment, named as fellow Australians. We've still got to work with them and figure out how do we build this country together? Do we want to? Or how do we do that? That's why this is a much bigger conversation, and we shouldn't get seduced into just saying, well, there's a recognised mob and then there's against, they're always against. The reality is we're trying to craft a future for our people. We're trying to see that our people will survive and continue to survive on this land. And how are we going to do that? And we've got some other ways that we can try and mark this, and I'll particularly take the point from my fellow panellists, is that whatever date the referendum date gets set for, the stuff still goes on. It will be a beautiful moment Sunday morning when we get the yes vote. That's going to feel different, but the euphoria and the happiness will pass once we start to get onto let's roll our sleeves up and keep working. You know, that's the reality. And so part of our challenge is not only what we want to construct in terms of what is our structures of our future, but how we're going to relate to the rest of the 20 million other Australians that we cohabitate this continent with.
Yeah, I think Mark makes a really important point. I mean, I think one of the problems with 67 though was that 5 months after it, the euphoria disappeared pretty quickly when the state refused to use 5126 to do anything. They refused to use it to prosecute what it was that Fakatzia was saying, which was, you know, we want recognition of customary laws, we want designated seats, we want better civics and Aboriginal history, and we want, and they just ignored them for 5 years. So my point would be, yes, there is all this other stuff going on, but before I would vote yes, I would like to see, even in legislation, a process by which we will move towards that settlement. Because I think that conversation is an important conversation. What does sovereignty mean? And it is somewhat of an amorphous kind of concept, because people see it in the context of state sovereignty, for example. And I think the quote, is that from my book? Not to give myself a plug. I think that's really spot on, because that's the way in which other countries have done that. That is to say, you deal with sovereignty through a settlement, and you deal with that through treaties. And I've got lawyer colleagues who keep saying that if you get symbolic recognition, that's the first step. You need that before you can do the rest. I don't agree with that, because I think 67 was a form of recognition. I think the High Court's decision in Melbourne was a form of recognition. If we're going to go down that track, I want some guarantee that we're going to enter into a proper process of reconciliation by which there is a settlement down the track. A lot of that work's already been done. I mean, you just have to look at the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation's work and the work that ATSIC did. I think Charles Perkins led the committee that did the social justice, the third arm of the social justice package called Rights, Recognition and Reform, which is still available online if you look, but it's a process towards settlement. And so I think if anything, what the past 5 years is, the kind of resistance from the mob has been so important, because it's made people stand up and go, right, actually, we need to reinvigorate that aspect. But we still need to keep pushing and reminding non-Indigenous Australians of that, because one of the disadvantages we have is that a lot of the settlements right across the world happen very early on. We're doing it very late, when in fact we shouldn't have to enter into that conversation with Australian people. It's a conversation with the state. So most Indigenous peoples had that conversation a very long time ago, where they didn't have to deal with 22 million people who very strongly adhere to formal equality and majoritarianism, that are very acculturated to a minimalist liberal democracy that is a very ballot box democracy, by which their only participation in civil society is through the ballot box. I mean, we're at a huge disadvantage. In addition to that, the state, and this is why I applaud Tony Abbott for saying, you know, back off on 2017. He actually didn't commit to it. But this, he can see, and Gillard could see, that this is a really complex issue, because you're dealing with the fundamental question of the legitimacy of the Australian state. They know it's really complex, and they know it shouldn't be rushed. And so, I think I'm just ranting now, but I can't remember what I was saying.
But yeah.
But like that's not a conversation to be had in Parliament or federal state level. It's got to be happening in communities. And like this discussion's got to go home with non-Indigenous peoples, thinking that Aboriginal people, they need recognition, to get up in the world. Or like we need a constitutional piece of paper to say that we need to get up in the world. When we don't, like the biggest thing we need is white folks to understand, the position that we're in right now as Aboriginal people is because of, the position that non-Aboriginal people are in. We're talking about, the pastoralist, we're talking about farming, we're talking about mining, we're talking, about, the police state, the education state, like these are the things that need to be really, really changed and discussed, to make this nation move forward, not a discussion, or, not applause or anything like that there, because, at the end of the day, it's people that make the world spin, and it's our yarns and our discussions that need to be, out there, whether it's at the pub, whether it's at home, whether it's at work, with family members and friends, like that's where the discussion of change happens. Because once we get an understanding of change, then we can have a movement, behind ourselves, to change. Not just, I guess, the perspective of how, non-Indigenous people see us, but the perspective of how they see themselves when they see us. That's what needs to be changed.
Butcher's paper. That's how Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation and ATSI, it's about getting into communities, butcher's papers and pens, and starting to design and imagine what it is, the kind of society that or community you want to live in. The only caveat I make there was that a lot of the early documents were done in the absence of a gender, of an equal gender representation, and that's still my concern. There needs to be 50% of Aboriginal women in the room.
We can do that just be men. There's just one more question. Two more questions, and that will cover the questions.
I guess firstly, I'd like to say thank you for sharing your opinions, your views, and your knowledge. Because when I came here, I didn't know what to think about the whole Recognise campaign. I was kind of sitting on the fence. But I guess for me, and probably a lot of people out there, what they want to know is, I guess, how can they visualise what something like this can do across the nation and locally for Aboriginal people when it comes to like what you're saying, truth and justice. I guess when it comes to the truth, we want to see changes, the impact of change with truth when it comes to like our national curriculum must be taught to our schools, because in turn that will make a change socially across our country. in terms of how they view Aboriginal people, and they can know the true story about Aboriginal people. And when it comes to the justice, what kind of impact will something like this make to legislations being put in place? Because what's happening at the moment is that Aboriginal people are getting incarcerated, alarming rates, and I guess for me, I want to be able to visualise what something like this can do to this country in terms of all of these things, because all of these things need to be addressed, because I think everybody's got a part to play when it comes to moving forward in this country. I guess us as a people, we need to come, we've got a role to play. The rest of the community and the government have a role to play. So I want to know what things that the government are going to do, because they can say all they want, but what real things are they going to do to make a change, like in this country with this?
So that's a really good question, and I'll be as quick as I can. The first point you made about civics and history is so important, because when we, as an expert panel, went out all over Australia and talked to a lot of not very friendly people that were not sympathetic at all to Aboriginal people, the one thing they all said was that they never learned about Aboriginal culture at school, and they also don't know civics, so they didn't actually know anything about the Australian Constitution or blah, blah, blah. So we actually did put in the report, we actually felt if you just abandoned the whole conrec thing and just put a lot of money into education, not just at schools at a primary and high school level, but also in terms of, university of the third age and, other ways in which community people can learn about Aboriginal culture. Because I think there's a thirst out there for that amongst non-Indigenous Australians, in addition to the fact that they feel like they know nothing about their own history, full stop. So that was really palpable in those conversations. So I think that's really important. And I certainly, and you can still hear that coming across from the community, and I think if you go forward with a referendum, there needs to be some sort of package associated with that. And the most important thing that I would raise there is the killing times, the frontier wars. And I think that's a really critical thing that this country needs to grapple with and continually tries to avoid, which is, that the political economy of early colonial Australia was the massacre of Aboriginal people. Why? Because to expand the colonies and to expand trade, they needed the land, and these people weren't moving, so they were massacred. And that's how if you look at the trajectory of the massacres, that's how it worked. The New South Wales colony went first, and then it kind of went up and across. And so I think the killing times is a really critical issue here. I don't think it's an embarrassing thing for Australians to discuss. It's just a part of Australian history. So on that question of what will this change? So as Mark has said, this is not the answer to everything. And whatever the model is, I would want there to be a new reconciliation process drawn out to laid out for us to address truth and justice, a really obvious, with milestones kind of track that we can move towards some form of settlement. But in terms of the legal thing, there's two kind of things on the table. What the reform is trying to do is to address, first of all, the fact that the Australian government, the Australian Federal Parliament tends, certainly on 4 occasions, to pass legislation that discriminates against Aboriginal people on the basis of their race. So one of the things the expert panel did was to recommend a provision called a racial non-discrimination clause that would seek to try and temper that tendency. Now, this clause will not necessarily stop the Northern Territory intervention, because when a court sits to do its work, they get all sorts of evidence before it, they have to interpret that evidence, and they need to make a decision about whether or not the laws that were passed were discriminatory. To some extent that involves what we think, what is it that community thinks, but it also involves what does that government think. And in recent times, the Australian High Court has interpreted the Racial Discrimination Act in an interesting way that perhaps one might not want to perhaps go down that track. But that's one option, is a judicial response to racism. So that would involve, perhaps in the future, next year, Abbott passing, or who's the other guy? Shorten passing discriminatory legislation, and us litigating. So we would have to raise funds, and you'd have to litigate that through the High Court. The other option that's been put on the table is a kind of it's not a judicial approach, it's a kind of parliamentary approach, which is before the racist legislation even gets sent, let's have a body that you have to send all the legislation through. And that would be a body of Aboriginal people who are all elected from around the country, and you could do that on the basis of perhaps the regional councils under ATSIC. You've still got the same regions, you can have the AEC do the elections. And then this body would receive all the legislation and probably policy that government is doing, and would then go and consult with the community and then come back and report to government. So one's a kind of parliamentary approach, one's a judicial approach. So the proposal on the table for the parliamentary approach, though, is that it's non-justiciable, which means that you can't litigate on it. But also, even if you said to the government, look, Mutijulu doesn't like this, they say no, the government can ignore that advice. So that's what some people think is the downside of it. On the other hand, Conservatives think that's the upside of it. So it's like, it's difficult to know. So there's two approaches in terms of the kind of current iteration of constitutional reform. So that's the kind of thing on the table, in addition to amendment to the race power, which is the power that they say commits discrimination on the basis of race. There's also, but it's kind of got a little bit messy. So it's confusing for constitutional lawyers. I don't even know what it's like for everybody else to keep up with it, because I can't keep up with it, and I'm paid to. So, I mean, I can understand your apprehension. In that, a lot of people I would sit on the fence too until I know what a model might look like. Once the model comes, I would assume we enter into some sort of negotiations on that model, and we get some sense from the community whether they agree or disagree, and also, as I said, try and negotiate some ancillary package that involves things like civics education. But currently, it's a little bit confusing. And then the other point is just the symbolism. So I think, and I stand by this, the expert panel did the best job that you will ever find in this country on dealing with the symbolism, which is we put it in the new head of power to make laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It does use, there's been some criticism in the community about the word advancement as being paternalistic. I disagree, because the word was chosen for its legal pedigree, not because of any historical connotation. And when the judges go to read it, they're not going to say, oh my God, that hurts Aboriginal people's feelings. They're going to say, oh, this has meaning in testamentary laws, or it has meaning in native title law, or it has, it's done as a kind of interpretive guide for judges. So we put the symbolism in the Constitution in this neat provision called Section 51A. We decided against a preamble, and that's because, there's unanimous support in the legal profession that you can't have a preamble to the Australian Constitution. If you do put it into the Australian Constitution, because the Constitution is just a section of the Act, there's problems, because they're going to put a no legal effect clause. But it's likely that the High Court will read down that no legal effect clause. So one of the problems we have is that nobody reads anything, and I mean politicians. So they're still supporting a preamble, but I just think that'll fall by the wayside. There is a suggestion for a symbolism outside of the Constitution in a kind of declaration that has no legal status. So it's not in legislation, it's not in the Constitution, it's just a kind of plebiscite, which is a, as you know, non-binding opinion poll of the nation. I don't support a declaration. I think it's dignified for us to have recognition in the Constitution. I think it is dignified for us to have legislative recognition. I think it's undignified for us to be recognised in a document that has no legal status in this country. So I don't support that at all. But so that's kind of where it's all sitting. It's all a little bit of a mess in the absence of political leadership.
Just my personal response to that is that part of this work at the moment, we're trying to hold together a whole spectrum of Australian opinion. Some Australian opinion that wants to make any constitutional reform to be as, I'll say, as weak as possible. Let's make it weak so it doesn't cause a big ripple effect. So we keep it weak, and they've got vested interest in doing that. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we've probably got people who want to make it as strong as possible in order to make its highest ripple effect. And somewhere in the middle, you've got most of Australians who are like, we just want something that's going to be all right, that's going to work.
Strong is normal in the rest of the world, by the way.
Yeah.
But the strong positions that we want are actually quite normal in other jurisdictions.
So somewhere in the middle there, that's where most of Australians are, right? We do have a voice that's loud over here, saying make it as weak as possible, but we don't know what the model looks like yet. So our feeling for wanting to make it as strong as possible, that's our feeling at the moment, but we don't know what it looks like yet. So when we see it, we'll know what it looks like. But at the moment, there's, for me, what the biggest thing that will change, and this is, I have to use the story that was told to me by one of the other recognised staff members. She said to her, as a young Aboriginal woman, it's the realisation that the next day, that 7 out of 10 Australians, 7.5, I think the latest poll would say, 7.5 out of Australians voted yes. That they actually wanted to remove that racism and to recognise our first status. They actually want to do that. What it looks like in terms of its substantial thing, we don't know yet. But at the moment, 75% of Australians will say, yeah, I'd vote for that. And what that means is that you and I, down at Queen Street, we could say, okay, 7.5 out of 10 of these people walking around actually took the time to say, yeah, I actually want to recognise that. That to me makes a difference to me as a black fellow walking on the street. And I had this accusation or this thing to say, what's this going to mean to the streets of Wilcannia, from a black fellow out there? And I'm like, well, this is what it means, Russ. It won't change the stuff that you deal with every day, but it can change some stuff at a bigger level. And there's some technical things that Megan's already covered as well. Yeah.
I think that's all we have time for tonight, but very, very quickly, if our audience would like to know more about the specific constructs that you talked about, where can they find more, starting with Bo?
I've got some flyers, that we made at the start of the year to hand out at the All-Stars game, and that we've got also down the kuril dhagun section, there's pages on Facebook, like the Brisbane Aboriginal Sovereign Embassy, we're always doing a lot of stuff around Brisbane, on a national scale, there's the Vote No to Constitutional Recognition page on Facebook. It's got quite a few, followers on there, they talk about, like these other sites, all of the discussion, that we need to have, and talk about the stuff that we've left out, but yeah, like there's a lot of stuff on social media, flying around, about, in regards to, some of the stuff I said tonight, and yeah, like I can give you some flyers, after the yarn too, if you want, yeah.
Megan?
I'd check your website. I'd also look at, apart from my book, I'm starting to urge Mob to go back to the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation documents and the ATSIC documents and go back and look at what our mob's already done. There's a lot of the groundwork's already been done here, and we just have to read it and remind ourselves of, the kind of groundwork's already been done. The other thing is the editor of Indigenous Law Bulletin's mouthing at me going, our website. So there's the Indigenous Law Centre website, which has a constitutional reform page, and in addition to that, the Indigenous Law Bulletin website, which is easily found by Googling, which has lots and lots of resources on this. We keep an eye on that. But I suppose I'd just echo what Bo said, and that is, I'm not in this, and if you have a look at the previous documents, our mob have never really pushed recognition. Symbolic recognition is something that came from the 1999 referendum, so it's a hangover of that. Our mob has never sought that recognition from the state, and I'm not particularly interested in that element of it, but I am interested in kind of legal equality. So I think, for me, keeping an eye on the substantive stuff is really critical in terms of us getting a good deal out of what's going to happen going forward. And I think if you go back and look at those documents, you'll see that that recognition is only really something that we've taken on board because that's what the state wants. And the state wants that form of recognition because it's symbolic and because it doesn't require them to give anything up and it costs very, very little. So that's why they're pushing that. But I think it's really important for everyone to go and re-engage with the substantive elements of our movement, which are things like the settlement, treaty, sovereignty, non-discrimination clause, those kinds of things. I think not enough people are students of the movement anymore, and I think that that's a really important thing that I keep telling my niece, who's actually Facebooking right now while we speak, to become a student of the movement. I'm assuming she's promoting our conversation.
And I guess, like having discussions like this here opens up the floor, for us as Aboriginal people, to have these discussions, it's endless, to where our future is, and we just, like those, like we said earlier, when India, kicked out Great Britain, when China had done the same thing, when African nations kicked out, the opposing colonising governments, Belgium, and France, and the Congo and that there. Not saying we can kick 20 million people out of this country, but what we can do, is actually have a formal discussion on how we can radically change this nation. The discussions are endless. We've been here since the first sunrise, so we've got a lot to talk about.
And there's the recognised website, recognise.org.au, but I would want to echo my fellow panellists to read both stuff. Read the stuff that Megan's written in that book. That book is really helpful and handy. Thanks. Here's the play. As a non-law literate person, I was like, man, I can't understand the jargonisation that the law mob can... so I don't have a law background, but for me to read that and to go, wow, that's really, really insightful. So I'd encourage you to pick that book up. The other point that Megan made, this is not a shallow conversation. This hasn't just turned up in the last 3 or 4 years. This conversation about how we get the mechanisms between our people and the rest of Australia has been going on for decades. So go and research its history. There's a history to this conversation, and this is where it's at the moment, in one form. There's other forms going on. I'd want to encourage you to not get stuck, because we need to be able to shift opinion and shift ideas in ourselves so we become smarter and not just say, I'm stuck on this, stuck on this, stuck on this. I'd encourage you to not get stuck, and I'd encourage you to remain hopeful. Even if you want to stay cynical, I'd encourage you to remain also hopeful.
I can be cynical and leaning.
Excellent. So a leaning, cynical, hopeful outcome is perfect, because if we don't have hope, all we're left with is the despair. So I'd want to encourage you to do that. Get informed, and let's try and make this moment in Australian history for all of us a better moment.
And on that note, if you can give a round of applause to our